Today we are going to discuss feminist criticism, which began in roughly the 1960s and continues into the present. Now, feminist criticism is concerned with the ways in which literature either undermines or reinforces the oppression of women. And it also assumes that the society in which we live is patriarchal or male-dominated. Furthermore, it considers how in literature the male point of view is prioritized over the female point of view. It's favored over the female point of view. Most works of literature, especially in the past, were produced by men. And as a result, the male point of view was considered unbiased or the norm. But this is not true. It's still specific to the male experience. And when we only have works written by males, we only are aware of the male experience, and the female experience is ignored. And feminist literary criticism also examines how women have been excluded from the literary canon. And the literary canon is just a fancy term for the body of works that have most often been read and taught and analyzed by scholars. So when we say that women have been excluded from the literary canon, we mean that their contributions to literature have not been recognized, or at least not to the same degree that they have for men. Feminist criticism also generally, historically, follows three waves of feminism. And the first was, well, it lasted from the late 1700s to the early 1900s. And people who were writing during this time were concerned with highlighting the inequalities between men and women, and above all, advocating for women's suffrage, which was finally gained in 1920 in America, or nearly 1920 in America. And that's also important to note, that when we're talking about feminist criticism and three waves of feminism, we're talking about American, United States history and Western European history rather than Eastern history. The second wave of feminism, which lasted from the early 1960s to the late 1970s, was concerned with working conditions, equal working conditions for men and women. Because during World War II, when the men in the family were away fighting, women began to enter the workplace. They had to get jobs in order to support themselves and their children, which they had never had to do before because the men were the breadwinners in the family. And then when the men came back from the war, they said to the women, now, and as they get back in the kitchen, which sounds harsh, but it's true. That's what happened. They said, you're not going to have a job. You're going to stay home, raise my kids, cook and clean the way you've always done. And women were not having it. Thus, the second wave of feminism. The third wave, which lasted from roughly the early 1990s and continues into the present, is concerned with intersections between gender, race, and class, chiefly race. This means that feminists at this time period are thinking about how the experience of being a white, heterosexual, middle-class woman is different from the experience of being a black woman, Latina woman, an Asian woman, etc. And furthermore, how it's different from being an upper class or lower class or lesbian woman. Because these are all different experiences and all different point of views that can't necessarily be united under one term, feminism. Now, you might be thinking, okay, all this makes sense, but how might I apply this criticism to literature myself? How do other people do it? How do I do it? So, this is a very good question, and it has a very good answer. Some key terms and questions that you can keep in mind while you're doing a literary analysis from this lens are agency, male gaze, sex versus gender, and female as the other. Agency is just a fancy way of saying power. So you can examine the power relationships between men and women, whether the man or the woman has more power, and how this is influenced by gender. Male gaze, you can see whether the male gaze is present in work. Male gaze is literally the way that a man looks at a woman, so that he objectifies or dehumanizes her. In other words, when a man sees a woman, or a male character sees a female character, he doesn't see a human being with thoughts and feelings of equal importance to his own. He sees a sexual object that's only purpose is to pleasure and gratify him. Gender versus sex is not a term but a concept, and it's important to keep in mind. It's important to distinguish between these because, although at first glance they're the same, they're quite different. Gender is determined by society, whereas sex is determined by biology. Using myself as an example, biologically, I am female. I have female traits and female sexual organs, but how feminine I am is determined by society. And in a work of literature, the same will be true of both female and male characters. How feminine or masculine they are will differ from, in some cases, their sex. Female as the other. As I mentioned earlier, most works throughout history, most literary works, have been produced by men. So, because the male point of view was the only point of view, the female point of view is often defined by how it differs from the male point of view. Female characters are defined by how they differ from the norm, from males and from male expectations of them, rather than by who they are as individuals. Also, if you want to do a slightly historical / feminist criticism, you can examine where the work falls in the literary tradition. Because, as I said, women have often been excluded from the literary canon. So, when and where a book was written can often have an impact on how women are portrayed, how they interact with men, their power relationships with men, because of the attitude toward women in the time and place that the book was written. And now that you have all of this information, now that you have these key terms, these concepts, and these historical movements in mind, you're ready to apply feminist criticism to your work of literature.